What you're watching unfold right now, simultaneously, on two entirely different fronts, is the kind of convergence that reshapes nations, and most Americans are barely connecting the dots. The Trump EPA's own internal regulatory impact analysis, the document they buried, not highlighted, projects that rolling back Clean Air Act limits on power plant pollution will cause thousands of premature deaths and drive up health costs for Americans by as much as $130 billion through 2047, more than 6 times the estimated savings to industry. That's not a critic's estimate, that's Washington's own math, hidden in plain sight, and while that slow-motion disaster is being written into policy, the Trump administration has simultaneously been pulling back on essential grid resilience support, leaving states, local governments, and utilities ill-equipped to maintain, let alone strengthen, the electric grid. Some of the projects now cancelled were specifically intended to allow hospitals, schools, and emergency centers to reduce blackout risks and speed power restoration. Think about that for a moment. The institutions where people go to survive, stripped of their safety net quietly in budget documents most people will never read. And then there's the other front. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel conducted military strikes on Iran, sparking what is now being called the 2026 Iran War. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, entered the Red Sea for the first time on March 7th, after transiting the Suez Canal, placing it squarely inside operational range of Iranian targets. As of early March, U.S. Central Command reported over 30 Iranian naval vessels sunk or destroyed, including an Iranian drone carrier ship the size of a World War II aircraft carrier, struck and set ablaze. The question now isn't whether this war is real, it absolutely is. The question is, where does it go from here, and who actually pays the price? Now let's slow this down and go through it properly, because when you peel back the layers here, what you find is not the story most Americans are being told. Start with the power grid story, because it is a domestic catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. The Trump administration finalized rules in February of this year that revoke the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to regulate climate pollution, an authority that has been the cornerstone of American clean air policy since 2009. And to understand just how significant that is, you have to understand what that 2009 endangerment finding actually meant. It was the legal backbone, the document that allowed the federal government to tell power plants, oil refineries, vehicle manufacturers, and industrial polluters that they could not freely dump unlimited toxins into the air that ordinary Americans breathe every single day. That finding gave the EPA its power to reduce greenhouse gases from the biggest sources of climate pollution in the country, and it took one administration, one memo, and one political agenda to unravel 16 years of environmental authority, just like that. And here is what makes this particularly jarring if you are an American who pays attention to these things. EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin says his job is to lower the cost of buying a car, heating a home, and running a business. That is the official reframing of the EPA's mission. Notice what is missing from that sentence. Not a single word about protecting lives, not a single mention of public health costs, not a word about what happens to the children in communities that sit downwind from coal-fired power plants when mercury, arsenic, soot, and nitrogen oxide start flooding back into the air without any federal ceiling on how much can be released. The EPA, the agency whose entire reason for existing is to protect Americans from environmental harm, has been restructured around the interests of the energy industry, and the death toll projected from this restructuring is not speculation. It is documented in the agency's own paperwork, in the regulatory impact analysis that the EPA was required to prepare, not highlighted but buried. The Trump EPA projects that repealing the carbon pollution standards would result in as many as 120 additional deaths from ground-level ozone and 100 additional deaths from fine particulate matter in 2035 alone. That is in a single year, 1 year. And the health cost projections run even deeper. The total increase in health costs that would result from the proposed rule would be as much as $130 billion through 2047, more than 6 times the estimated cost savings to industry. So Americans are being told this is about economic efficiency and energy freedom. But the government's own math says you are paying $6 in health costs for every $1 saved by the industry. That is not a trade-off. That is a transfer from the public to the corporations. And it doesn't stop at carbon pollution. The EPA has also dismantled the mercury and air toxic standards, protections that had, since 2012, led to a 90% reduction in mercury emissions, an 80% drop in other metals, and helped save up to 11,000 lives each year, 11,000 lives every year. Those standards are now gone. And the administration justified it not with new science, but with the argument that it gives industry certainty, certainty for industry, uncertainty for every family living near a coal plant in Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, or North Carolina. The EPA also eliminated a requirement that power plants install systems to continuously monitor the amount of pollution they emit, which means not only is the air less regulated, but there is now less transparency about how bad it actually gets. You can't measure what you are not tracking, and if you are not tracking it, you can't be held accountable for it. A 2021 study funded by the EPA itself and published in the journal Science Advances found that fine particulate matter alone still accounts for 85,000 to 200,000 excess deaths per year in the United States. That is before these rollbacks. That is baseline America, with regulations still nominally in place, and now systematically those guardrails are being removed one by one. A non-profit made up of over 700 former EPA officials studied how a dozen toxic pollutants are poised to wreak even greater havoc due to the recent rollbacks, including air pollutants linked to respiratory diseases, reproductive health harms, and early deaths, particulate matter, ozone, benzene, formaldehyde, and vinyl chloride. These are not fringe activists making these claims. These are former career scientists and administrators who spent their professional lives inside the agency. And their conclusion is the same. Americans are being knowingly exposed to more pollution, and the people making these decisions have the data that confirms the harm. The report noted that when the EPA weakens standards on multiple pollutants at once, residents in the most affected areas don't face 5 separate health burdens. They face a multiplied cumulative health burden. Children breathe a chemical cocktail daily. That phrase deserves to land, a chemical cocktail, daily. And the communities absorbing the worst of it are not the ones with lobbyists in Washington. A 2023 New England Journal of Medicine study concluded that reducing fine particulate pollution alone would disproportionately benefit Black Americans at all income levels as well as low-income whites. The communities with the least political leverage are bearing the greatest physical cost of these decisions. That is not accidental. That is the way power has always worked in this country, and the way it continues to work, dressed up in the language of deregulation and economic freedom. Now shift your attention to the Middle East, because what is happening there is equally consequential, and the two stories are more connected than they initially appear. Beginning on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated joint attacks on various sites in Iran, starting a major war aimed at regime change. Codenamed Operation Roaring Lion by Israel and Operation Epic Fury by the United States, the attacks targeted key Iranian officials, military commanders, and facilities and killed hundreds. This is not a limited strike. This is not a targeted retaliation for a specific provocation. The stated objectives of Operation Epic Fury, as laid out by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, are to dismantle Iran's ability to project power outside its borders, eliminate Iran's ballistic missile systems, destroy the Iranian Navy, and ensure Iran cannot rapidly rebuild or reconstitute its combat capability. Those are not the objectives of a surgical operation. Those are the objectives of a war of comprehensive military destruction. The operation began with joint strikes in the cities of Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, and Kermanshah, and included the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, whose compound was destroyed, along with several other senior Iranian officials. Think about the magnitude of that for a moment. The supreme leader of Iran, the head of state, the religious figurehead of an entire theocratic structure, assassinated in a coordinated strike. This is the kind of event that rewrites the geopolitical map. And yet, much of the American public discourse around it has been filtered through the lens of military success metrics and official press briefings that use language like precise, effective, and mission objectives achieved. The story is far larger than those press briefings suggest. On the first day of Operation Epic Fury, the US military struck over 1,000 targets, unleashing enormous firepower in the opening 24 hours. The operation launched in broad daylight at 9:45 in the morning Tehran time in tight coordination with a parallel Israeli offensive, and Iran did not simply absorb that. Iran retaliated by launching missiles at Israel and US military facilities across the region, including locations in Bahrain, Qatar, Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. American bases across the entire region came under attack. 3 American service members were killed in those attacks, and 5 were seriously injured. And those numbers, as somber as they are, do not begin to capture the broader regional destabilization that Operation True Promise 4, Iran's formal retaliation designation, has set in motion. Into all of this walks the USS Gerald R. Ford. The Ford Carrier Strike Group has been participating in Operation Epic Fury, the US-Israeli campaign against Iran. The carrier has been deployed since June of 2025 and has been extended multiple times. By the time you are watching this, USS Gerald R. Ford has spent 255 days at sea, with current operational planning potentially extending the mission to about 11 months, which would keep the carrier deployed until May 2026. If that happens, it will break the post-Vietnam War record for carrier deployments. The crew of roughly 4,500 personnel has been away from home for the better part of a year, in an active war zone, launching combat operations every single day. Frustrated sailors were reportedly purposefully blocking pipes due to unhappiness about remaining at sea due to the conflict. That is a detail that gets almost no coverage, but it tells you everything about the human cost of keeping the world's largest warship indefinitely deployed in a combat theater. Now here is the question that serious analysts should be asking, and that very few in the mainstream press are willing to sit with honestly. Iran's potential acquisition of China's CM-302 supersonic anti-ship missiles would significantly increase the risk to US naval assets in the Persian Gulf. And that is not a hypothetical. Iran, China, and Russia signed a trilateral strategic pact on January 29, 2026. Although it does not constitute a mutual defense treaty, it provides diplomatic cover, intelligence cooperation, economic resilience, and technological support. China has reportedly provided satellite imagery and early warning data on US force deployments, while Chinese surveillance vessels have monitored US naval operations in the region. So the USS Gerald R. Ford is not operating against an isolated regional power. It is operating in a theater where its movements are being monitored and communicated by a near-peer adversary with a very direct interest in the outcome of this war. Iran's retaliation strategy is shaped by a central tension, demonstrating defiance while avoiding actions that could trigger its own military destruction. Several escalation thresholds remain critical, including attacks on Gulf oil infrastructure, mining operations in the Strait of Hormuz, and proxy attacks on US soil. Those are the thresholds that have not been crossed yet. The word "yet" is doing a lot of work in that sentence. In March 2026, it was reported by ABC News that the US recently acquired information that as of early February, Iran allegedly aspired to conduct a surprise attack using unmanned aerial vehicles from an unidentified vessel off the coast of the United States, specifically against unspecified targets in California, in the event that the US conducted strikes against Iran. California, not a military base in Bahrain, not a diplomatic compound in Qatar, the American homeland. That is the scale of what has been set in motion here, and it demands a level of honest public scrutiny that is simply not happening in the dominant media conversation. Now connect this back to the power grid story, because this is where the analysis deepens. The Trump administration signed an executive order directing the U.S. Department of Defense to purchase electricity from coal-fired power plants and provided $175 million to 5 coal plants in West Virginia, Ohio, North Carolina, and Kentucky to keep them online beyond their scheduled retirement dates. So on one hand, you have a foreign war being prosecuted in the name of American national security and the protection of American interests. And on the other hand, domestically, the administration is investing in the very energy infrastructure that its own regulatory documents confirm will cause thousands of additional American deaths over the next 2 decades. These are not two separate conversations. They are one conversation about who this government is actually protecting and from what. According to the EPA's own calculations, even a 10-month delay in requiring oil and gas operators to reduce methane pollution will add the equivalent of 25 million gas cars worth of pollution into the atmosphere. And that is just one regulation, one delay in one industrial sector. Multiply that across the dozens of rollbacks now in motion, and you start to understand that the air quality trajectory for the United States is not a flat line. It is a curve, and it is bending in the wrong direction. Oil and gas pollution alone is already responsible for 91,000 premature deaths per year in the United States. Those are not hypothetical future deaths. Those are Americans dying right now every year from the existing baseline of pollution before these new rollbacks take full effect. What you are witnessing, if you can hold both stories in your mind at the same time, is a government simultaneously conducting its most aggressive foreign military operation since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, while dismantling the domestic health protections that keep its own citizens alive at home. Abroad, the justification is national security. Domestically, the justification is economic growth. And the people paying the price in both cases are not the architects of these policies. They are the sailors on an aircraft carrier that has been at sea for nearly a year, the families living in communities downwind from coal plants in Kentucky and West Virginia, the children breathing benzene and formaldehyde in neighborhoods that never had a lobbyist to speak for them. That is the real picture of what is happening in America right now, and it deserves to be seen clearly, without the noise of partisan framing on either side. The numbers are not partisan, the deaths are not partisan, and the questions being raised by the trajectory of these two simultaneous crises are questions every American, regardless of political affiliation, should be sitting with right now.